Good afternoon, everyone. So this is the PowerPoint I was meant to present the last time I saw you, the last time in the latest class we saw one another. So I collected a series of points that I came across in terms of methodology and execution of the synthesis. I will not spend too much time repeating the things that I have already mentioned in previous corrections, but I would like to pinpoint or to emphasize some of them because you are getting closer to the exam and you are not always appreciating some of the points, or at least making sure you do not reproduce those mistakes in the next assignment. So I will go quickly through some of them, and then I will try to focus on those you absolutely need to sort out for the final exam. I've already mentioned this. When it comes to the title, you either have to be descriptive but not too generalist. So you wouldn't say journalistic, sorry. So you wouldn't have to say death row, for example. Just death row or death penalty is too simple a title. So you would have to go for something that is already indicating the direction in which the paper is going. You want to show that there is an evolution when it comes to the death penalty. Maybe that's something you can already mention. You could say the future of the death penalty is already a bit better than simply the death penalty. When it comes to puns, I have already mentioned this before, make sure it works. Many of you went for the death of the death penalty. Another one that could have worked was death penalty on... no, I'm going to have to change this because I made a mistake. So let me erase this. So death penalty on death row. Being on death row is waiting to be executed. So death penalty on death row indicates that maybe the end of death penalty or abolition is in sight, right? It's coming. So that was interesting, maybe to use that pun on the death penalty dying. You went in the right direction when it came to this. Now the second point, some of you still don't know how to write an introduction. Make sure you learn a model by heart that you can reuse for every single paper. You do not have many papers left, many assignments left, but make sure you have your prompts or the beginning of each sentence. Remember, there are always several stages in an introduction. So general statements first, then introducing the key question, the resources, and possibly eventually a plan, depending if you're taking the SON assignment or the competitive examination, or the CCNP is the one you have to choose, right, in between. Now, figures must be summed up. I am not interested in knowing percentages about those who are in favour, those who oppose the death penalty. Instead of giving me lots of percentages such as 37 of people are in favour of this, or 63% people are opposing this, I am not interested in figures. What I'm interested in is making sure you interpret this. You would say most people, or 2/3 of people. That makes more sense. Or you would say a majority of people, more people are in favour of abolition than others, for example. But if I see too many figures in a paper, it usually indicates that you simply report those figures, but you do not give them meaning or sense. So a sentence is 1,000 times better than figures in a paper. Be very careful the way you introduce the sources of the document. Once again, I mentioned in class there were changes. So Central is expecting you to introduce the sources the way you have been learning to do it. So you would have to say, The Economist says, or The Guardian emphasizes. Make sure at least when you indicate the name of the paper, you do it in the right fashion. So you might say, according to The Guardian. But if you do not want to use this necessarily, because you would have to repeat this quite often, according to this, according to that, you would simply start with the name of the paper and say, The Guardian emphasizes, and then you start straight away with the idea that you collected on this paper. You wouldn't need to necessarily spend too much time indicating the source. Start straight away with the name of the paper. Honestly, that works the best. Be careful, some of you went for really strange sentences like Troy Davis was executed by the Guardian. This is definitely not the way to introduce the name of a paper. If you say so, the Guardian is well, in the latest example, is the one killing Troy Davis. It doesn't make sense. So at least if you start with the name of the newspaper, well, we understand that you refer straight to the information. The next 2 points are obviously essential for the content of your synthesis. Make sure you select the right key statement, select the right outline. I think many of you decided to discuss the ethical dimension of the death penalty. Didn't make sense here because most of the documents were not really discussing the ins and outs, the pros and cons of the death penalty. They were giving you lots of information, data, facts on how mentalities, opinions, mindsets were evolving, changing, right, and were being altered and modified. So what you had to really show in this paper, and I will come back to this in the second slide, is how in the future the death penalty will change. Well, that's what you had to show. So what future for the death penalty was possibly the best key statement, and not necessarily the US itself, but you were given indication about what was going on in the entire world. So you had to mention the death penalty in general. The outline tended to go in the direction of a growing international pressure on the US for them to abolish the death penalty. So describing the polarized, or the, like, when we say polarized, we mean that people are opposed. So the oppositional or the polarized opinions of people in the US, some of them support it, but we see that there is a change. And on top of this, the last paragraph could have been about, as I said, the growing international pressure, the mounting pressure, especially from Europe, from institutions such as the United Nations, which are requiring or demanding countries to join in to abolish the death penalty, right? And cases such as Troy Davis, miscarriages of justice, which means the justice has not been executed the way it should have, is adding to the change of mind in the US. When it comes to the vocabulary, next point, make sure it is precise and accurate. You might find this funny. I found this in the paper, but when you say this summer is, well, that would be a mistake anyway, but this summer is built with, we cannot understand anything you say. It's your opening sentence. It gives already a very wrong impression to the examiner correcting your paper. So summer is a season. I love summer, but you would have to say summary. So it doesn't make a lot of difference for some of you to use summer, summary. You're pretty close, but a word is a word. If you call a table a chair and a chair a table, then everything becomes very befuddled and difficult to understand. So using the right vocabulary also helps you add nuances and qualifications. Sometimes you like precision because what you want to express is correct, but the way you do it is wrong because you do not have the perfect word to express those views. And this is when sometimes I do not even understand what you tried to say, and that's when I can sometimes blame you for not mentioning such and such piece of information, and then you tell me yes, but I did, but I couldn't see it because the words were not the right ones, right? Or the turn of phrase, the expression was not the right one. And sometimes it goes as far as saying the opposite of what the text is expressing. So be very careful with the vocabulary. Always make sure you know the small differences between words, that when you learn a word, you do not learn it just so that you know just about how to remember it. It needs to be precise. It needs to be spelled properly as well. You are writing a paper. Make sure you do all this. The next one, do not add information in brackets. I've already mentioned this. Some people, in an afterthought, add things in brackets because, well, they want to add something. If you want to add something, you add it the normal ways, in addition, furthermore, but you would not add things in brackets. Do not express opinion, and I'm particularly thinking about the conclusion. Many people conclude their papers by expressing a form of view or a stance on the subject. Many of you said, well, hopefully in the future the death penalty will disappear. Well, that might be your opinion, but you're not supposed to deliver this opinion in your paper. You could say, the future of the death penalty remains to be seen. And there's no opinion here, we're just saying we don't know what's written on the wall for the death penalty, right? So make sure you look at your papers. Every time I write opinion, try to understand how you expressed an opinion. I know some of you do not realize that they're expressing their views. Transitions are essential as well. I gave you 2 examples to really show you how it matters. The first one, well, they're all taken from your papers. Death penalty kills and impacts families. That was the end of one paragraph. And then the second one started with, it is disappearing. So you're saying death penalty kills and impacts, and then you said it is disappearing. We need something here. You say, yet it is disappearing, or however, this process is, well, vanishing progressively, incrementally vanishing. Or so you would need something between this information and this information. It might be clear in your mind. It's certainly not for someone reading your paper, someone who is not supposed to have read the articles prior to reading your paper. Another example, 700 people are on death row. As I can't remember who W is, it's probably the name of the journalist. America is being transformed. Here, it's almost a contradiction. You're saying that a lot of people are on death row. I think it was Texas you were talking about. This is the normal way in the US. The death penalty has been written in the Constitution for hundreds of years, so it is the norm. If you say America is being transformed because they have people on death row, then you say almost the opposite of what the situation is. So make sure, once again, you use a transition or you explain better, right, in a better light, what you wanted to say. The last 2 points is, the last 2 points are that the interpretation of the information you select. Telling me that the countries using the death penalty are China, the Middle East, and the USA is all very well, but what I want for you to understand is that it's really strange to see the USA standing out among countries such as China and the Middle East, which, sorry for expressing a view, are dictatorships, or at least they're authoritarian regimes. So it seems strange that the USA should be part of this specific club of countries still using the death penalty. What is interesting to mention here is that the USA is standing out in an array of countries, in a collection of countries which are more authoritarian regimes. So it's a bit strange because the USA is a democracy, and you would have to mention this surprising fact. The last point is making sure the information you give is relevant. If you simply say, in Saudi Arabia, Abdu was executed, first, I don't know who Abdu is, and if you simply write this sentence without adding any extra piece of information or any interpretation, then what is the point of this information? What do you want to say? Do you want to draw a parallel with Troy Davis? Do you want to say this is wrong? Do you want to, what was wrong with this execution, right? So you need to be more, like, once again, to express more or give more explanations and not simply copying what is in the text. You understood that someone was executed. Why is it a relevant piece of information? Why does it matter in your paper, right? So this was the methodology aspect of your papers during the mock exam. Now the second slide concerns, and there are only 2 points, you'll be happy with this, interpreting the documents. I noticed many of you did not understand this point regarding the cost of facilities. Facilities are the way you organize buildings, facilities. Then usually we use it for amenities or buildings. Facilities are special places, and you were talking about the special places for the people who were on death row. Many of you said the cost of facilities are so expensive for prisoners that it's cheaper to execute the inmates or the prisoners. What the text said is that keeping inmates. Inmates is another word for prisoners. So keeping inmates on death row is expensive. Most of them undergo, to undergo is the verb I would use here. So to undergo is to go through. Many inmates go through a very long judicial process before they are executed. The US doesn't execute people straight away very fast without first making sure they studied the case. So it takes quite a long time to do, and sometimes some of the inmates on death row can be up to 25 years on death row, and it costs a lot of money to have special facilities or special buildings for those who are supposed to be executed. They are not mixed with other prisoners. It costs a lot of money. There is extra security for those people because most of the time they are very serious criminals, and this is an anti-death penalty argument. This is a justification for abolishing the death penalty. You might justify that economically it costs a lot of money to keep those prisoners on death row. We'd better just give them a life sentence and mix them with other prisoners, and then that would be it. Now, the second point that I would like to make regards the graph that many of you did not manage to interpret properly. The graph said that, yes, indeed, the curve was going up and down. Well, I'm exaggerating. That was not exactly how it was. So first, this is something you could have mentioned. You could say opinions have changed over time. Right, and I would like to mention something to you that you might not know. So I'm going to take all of this to explain this on this slide. Opinions have changed when it comes to the death penalty in the US. In the 1970s, if you look at your graph, the curve is going down because at the time, from 1972 to 1976, the president at the time, Nixon, had abolished of the death penalty. He had abolished death penalty. So there was no death penalty anymore in the US. It came back in the 1980s, 1990s, with the crackdown. Crackdown is when you become very strict with something. From Ronald Reagan, who was the new president, crackdown on drugs especially, or drug-related crimes. Drug-related crimes. The interpretation that is often given is that in the 70s it was a time of peace and love and hippie time, and people were consuming lots of drugs. They were opposed to war. Remember, the Vietnam War was going on, so they were opposed to this war, and they were repelled. They did not approve of the death penalty. They thought it was cruel and violent. But in the 1980s, maybe the excess in the use of drugs led to the criminality rising. So the number of crimes rose dramatically, which led the president at the time, as I said, Ronald Reagan, to crack down on those crimes and on drugs especially, and to put everybody in prison. This is the moment when the USA filled its prisons considerably. Right? So that's the reason you get ups and downs in history. It depends, right? This is something you might not have known, but at least you could have said that opinions have changed over time. So it's not set in stone, which means it's not written forever. Sometimes, as you could see, things might be abolished, but come back later. So we don't know about the future of the death penalty. It might come to a close, it might come to an end at some point, but come back in 100 years, right? The second point that was important to make is that by the end, the lines were getting closer. So these were the people in favor. These were the people who were against the death penalty. And obviously there were still more people in favor of the death penalty than others. But the gap between those who were in favor and those who were opposed was becoming narrower and it was becoming narrower. So the gap was bridged. It seems that opinions are getting closer and closer until at some point maybe they cross. We don't know in the future. This is a question mark in the future, but at least the opinions are changing and people are mollified. That's a word you could use. They're mollified, which means that they become a bit more flexible, a bit more lenient on the subject, and they seem to be less in favor of the death penalty and more in favor of its abolition. So that was the trend. So it doesn't mean that more people were in favor of the death penalty than others. It just meant that opinions were changing in the direction of an abolition. That's what it meant. Right, next slide is grammar, right? So very quickly, I'll go through those 2 points. The present perfect remains a major obstacle for many of you. Be very careful, you cannot use the present perfect with a date. Something I noticed is, especially during the oral exams, when I said a date, and I'm going to mention this with since. When you say since 1991, people have changed their minds. Well, I'm imagining this because I'm not sure this is the case. Changed their minds. This is a bit of a mess. I don't like this. I'm going to make it a bit better. There you go. So, changed their minds. Right. There is a date indeed, but there's also since. And since mechanically forces you to use the present perfect. Every single time you start a sentence with since, which originates the moment when this action started, you need to use the present perfect. If you use not the starting point, but the number of years that have gone by since the start, you would say for 25 years, people have changed their minds, which is a bit strange as a sentence. They changed their minds for a very long time. Right, but if you see for and since, that's the moment you would have to use the present perfect. I have repeated this over and over. I know it's not a simple concept. Be careful, some words trigger or they automatically require the need of the present perfect. I'm thinking about for decades because, well, you get for a start, so that's the major indication. Over the last few years is an equivalent of for the last few years, so you would have to use the present perfect. And recently is a word that most of the time necessitates the use of the present perfect. Now, second point, this one, there is a dark past that prevents the establishment of a fairer justice system. I reused this from one of your papers. There is fine, there's nothing wrong with this. Well, you need to make sure you anticipate what comes next, because some of you use there is a lot of people, but a lot of people is a plural, so you would have to change this. So there are a lot of people. That's not what is the problem. The problem is that it's a bit heavy-handed, it's a bit ploddy, it's a bit not awkward, but when you say there are, maybe it's better to start straight away with the information. So remove this and start with a dark past prevents the establishment of a fairer justice system. Not saying that there's something wrong with there are. It just sounds a bit scholar, a bit like it's not very formal and it's not very stylish to use there are. So this is more a question of style. The verb agreement is another problem. If you start a sentence in the present tense, you would need to carry it on in the present tense most of the time. But if you start in the past, you would have to use something, maybe, I said in the present tense, but actually this is the present tense, this is the past. This is the past, which means your past becomes a past perfect. Let me give you an example. So let's focus on this first sentence. Il dit qu'il fait ça. Let's have a look. So this is the sentence. Now, this verb is in the present tense. So he says that he did this or that, right? Usually it would be that because we're talking about something in the past. He did that rather than he did this. But it depends. Now, if you report this sentence, you want to to report those words, but in the past. You say this in French, and it would translate as, my pen doesn't work. He said, oh, wait a minute, I was using the present tense again, so I'm going to take that off. There you go, back to my pen. So he said that, and this verb tense here is a past perfect. So he said that he had done this. You need to make sure that this present becomes a past and this past becomes a past perfect. It's part of the verb agreement rule. So if you say something in the present, it becomes past. If you say something in the past, I'm gonna have to write this here, in the past, it becomes past perfect. Okay? And it makes sense, right? Because as I explained, I think to some of you, and I'm gonna write at the top, if you say, he said that he had done this, it means that on a timeline, if we stand here, okay, so this is the time we're talking, he said, there's something in the past, he had done this, the thing he has done is before the moment he says it. So first he did something, then he said it, okay? So he said he had done something before, right? And this is how the past perfect works. Back to the slides, which is a bit of a mess, all of this, so I might erase some of my explanations. There you go, so I have space for this particular rule I've explained to you before. Using apostrophe S most of the time applies to humans or people for whom it's easy to, how shall I explain this? People who possess something. People who possess something most of the time are humans. So you would say, my dad's car, or you would say, my neighbor's house, which means the car belongs to my dad, the house belongs to my neighbor, right? You cannot use this anytime you feel like. If you say the exhausting long, I don't know, the exhausting long hour job of my dad. If you say my dad's, well, actually it works. That's not the best example, the exhausting. I'm going to use another one because it's always when you need an example, they can't find one. But if you get maybe something that is a bit long, like not my dad's car, but you say this. I've got an example. So I'm gonna, that's it. I needed time, but I've got an example. So I'm gonna reuse it. It said, the man my mom has been dating lately. Scott, you would obviously not do this. The man my mom has been dating lately's car. We know the car belonged to the man my mom has been dating lately, but that's far too long and it doesn't work anyway, right? It would have to be to make sense, and usually it's just a noun group that is rather short, not a long sentence. That obviously is impossible. Sometimes the reason you use the sometimes, sorry, need to get used to this. So I need my eraser. Sometimes the reason you use the apostrophe S is when you indicate a time, like today's paper or yesterday's news. Right. This is one of the only cases in which you can use this apostrophe with something that is not human. But you wouldn't say, and this maybe is what I'm trying to explain, and once again I need my eraser, you wouldn't be able to say the house's roof, because Yes, the roof belongs to the house, but the house is non-human. The house doesn't possess anything. You possess the house. So you say the roof of the house. That would be the more natural way. You use it a lot. Many people said the death sentences and... Well, that doesn't work because the death sentence is not a person. So you cannot use it that way. All right? And the last one, well, it concerns only a few students. But if you get an opportunity to use an adjective over a noun, do it. And I will give you a very simple example. Many people said it's a society problem. Now, this is a noun. This is in front of a noun, which is supposed to be an adjective. So there is an adjective for this word. It's social. So it's better to say a social problem. It requires that you might know the adjective that stands for society. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not, right? If you talk a discrimination problem, you say, well, you could say a discrimination problem, and you could say, for example, if it's expression problem, you can say expressional problem. So you can use this ending that indicates it's an adjective, right? Last, well, actually it's not the last, I think it's the penultimate slide. Vocabulary, make sure you do not get them mixed up. It's capital punishment, judicial killing, death penalty. You cannot mix them up. You cannot say capital killing or death punishment. That doesn't exist. It has to be a stock phrase, a set phrase that you use. You cannot change them as you go along, right? And this is a word that would have been helpful to many of you. You wanted to say that someone innocent had been executed. First, do not forget that the person was deemed innocent. He was supposed to be innocent. He was allegedly innocent. But we weren't sure about Troy Davis' innocence, right? So what you meant is a miscarriage of justice, which is when justice is not fair, has been possibly carried out, but in a wrong fashion, right? Killing innocent, for example, is called a miscarriage of justice. I will send you by email the vocabulary in relation to the justice system, which is packed with technical terms that you cannot escape. You have to know those terms. There is only one way of saying this, a miscarriage of justice. The last slide is translation practice. So I leave you with this. I would like you to work on those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sentences. You can send them by email to me. These are very common mistakes that I came across. Be very careful with this. For example, I'm just going to give you indications as to how to translate this. When you express a probability, you could use models. There's a 50% chance that this may be happening, so you would have to use this in your sentence. Same thing, this is a question of verb agreement, so be very careful with the verb tenses. This one is focused on the translation of this particular section, right, which we have already worked in class last week, so you should know how to do this. Be very careful in this sentence. The key word would be this one, so I'm just making sure I frame the words that you have to focus on. This one as well requires a particular structure to make it better, so have a look at this. I think this one is a question of verb agreement as well. To want works in a specific way. To want somebody to want to do something. So, but this is not what this is about. This is this question of verb tense, right, that you have to respect, verb agreement. And this one is particular when you use a verb that words that expresses a feeling. It's frightening that, it's not normal that, it's outrageous that. Most of the time you would have to use the subjunctive, so I'll let you think about how to translate the subjunctive in English. We have already gone through this. You must have written this somewhere down in your lesson, so I'll let you send me back your answers, and then I could possibly post you a video or just simply the answers, right, with explanations, so that you might know how to switch this from French into English. Right, hope this lesson helped. If you